Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Call with Larry Elder. I'm Bruce Karasik, co-founder of the Jewish Republican Alliance. So glad you could all join us. We're very excited to have Larry here today. You know, I've said this before, but I want to say it again. In my mind, when I think of courageous people, I think of hardworking people. I think of Larry Elder. He's at the top of my list. And Larry, we salute you again today for your courage and your personal sacrifice that you've shown over the years by speaking the truth. No matter what others may say. Larry has a new film out. It's called Uncle Tom, and it's a great movie, and it's an important movie. It's about the difficulties about being a Black conservative in America. It's a must-see. And in a few minutes, we're going to speak to Larry about Uncle Tom. But first, you know, the hypocrisy on the left has been so blatant and becoming more evident every single day. On June 20th, just recently, a 19-year-old Black man, his name was Horace Anderson Jr., was shot and killed in Seattle's lawless chop zone. And Horace Anderson Sr., after losing his dear son, didn't even get a call from Seattle's Democrat mayor, nor anyone from the so-called Black Lives Matter group. No protests, no sorrow, no outrage at all from the left. And I'm finding that really difficult to accept. But do you know who did call him? President Trump called him to offer whatever comfort and support and condolences he could. I mean, I applaud the president for doing so, but the left has been virtually silent on that. You know, was deeply troubled to hear that the New York Museum of Natural History is taking down its monument to former President Theodore Roosevelt. You know, I just watched the Ken Burns documentary called The Roosevelts, and I learned that the first president to ever host an African-American in the White House was President Theodore Roosevelt. And who did he have? He had Booker T. Washington. You know, for those of you who don't know who Booker T. Washington was, but he was an American educator, he was an author, he was a speaker, he was an advisor to multiple presidents, and he was a former slave. And he became the voice of former slaves and their descendants, a very important figure in our history. Those on the left, you know, they don't take the time to learn about our history with open minds. You know, erasing the past to me is like burning books that you don't agree with. And that's not what this country should ever be about. And finally, I saw a report that really troubled me on Tucker Carlson this week about, most of you probably saw this, Patricia and Mark McCloskey were sitting in their bedroom or their dining room, and a mob of people, hundreds of people, came threatening to kill them, kill their family dog. They come out with a gun. They try to protect themselves. The mob leaves, and then they post his personal information all over the internet. He got no support, and it was really sad to see a man who try to defend himself from mob rule being deemed a racist. I know nothing about his politics, but I know I'm against mob rule. You know, for the survival of our fundamental rights, it's important as much as any time I can ever remember. And I still believe in the ultimate wisdom of the vast majority of the American people. I am counting on the fact that the American people will not stand for lawlessness, but I am inspired and energized whenever I hear Larry Elder, and today I know you will be too. So I'd like to introduce fellow co-founder Mitch Silberman. Mitch?
Hello, JRA community. It's always so exciting when we're together. Many of you were with us on March 11th of this year when we hosted Candace Owens. We were very blessed that evening that who introduced her, none other than the sage. And Larry had such a strong presence that evening. I want to focus on one very important concept that Candace shared with us that night. But not for Larry Elder, I don't know that we would have ever heard of Candace Owens. Larry didn't know it, but he was her mentor. She was exposed in one of his videos. Start reading his columns, and look what she turned out today. She is by far one of the most influential Black conservative women in America, thanks to Larry Elder. Now, if you've listened to Larry over the decades like I have, you know he had his own mentors. He had Dennis Prager, Walter Williams, Dr. Thomas Sowell, who just turned 90, and of course his father. So what I want to impose upon you is the importance of mentoring. Now, it doesn't have to be formal. It could be informal. It could be in a moment. It could be sharing a discussion, forwarding an article, encouraging someone to purchase a very important documentary called Uncle Tom. But there's a phrase in Hebrew called Hineni, here I am. And now more than ever, you have to stand up and be counted. Last week, Brandon Strock spoke to us, and he said a very important thing, that we can no longer be the silent majority. We have to be the unsilent majority. So I want to implore you to start mentoring others, even just with humor, with education, not to be confrontational, but to really change the path of their lives. And I'll share 2 brief stories with you. Last Saturday evening, Stephanie and I invited a couple over for dinner. We've known her for 20 years, him for 10. We have no idea what their politics are. And sure enough, politics came up. And they both happen to be Jewish. They're incredible people. They're successful entrepreneurs, family-oriented, wonderful Americans. And she asked me, why is President Trump being called anti-Semitic? And she was very concerned that he was anti-Semitic. Now, for those of you on the Zoom call, you know there couldn't be anything farther from the truth. He is the most pro-Israel, pro-Jewish president the United States has ever had. But she didn't know. And so she was asking, she was starving to know. And I shared with her the facts that you all know, how amazing he is. And she said, why is the media lying to us? She was so upset, like, why? How come I didn't know this? Why are they calling him anti-Semitic? So it was a great opportunity that over dinner and cocktails, I mentored her, and she left with a whole new understanding of our president. 2 days ago, Stephanie and I were in a lovely town called Cambria. We were shopping in an outdoor garden, and I ran into an older woman with a mask on, and she looked at me and she pulled the mask down. And she said, I hate these things. And I said, I understand. But this is the key part. She said, I want my liberty. I don't want people telling me what to do. And I said, amen to that. And then she looked at me and she said, I am 70 years old. I am part Black. I am part Jewish. And I am not marching into the ovens for anybody. That is literally what she said to me. And I guarantee if she's saying that to me, because I created the opening for her to share, she's probably saying it to others. So now more than ever, Hineni, here I am. You need to speak up. You need to educate. You need to let people know that you love America, you love Israel, and you're willing to do your part to preserve the Judeo-Christian values upon which our great country was founded. And now we're going to do our part. I get to introduce one of my absolute favorite people on the planet, Larry Elder. As you know, Larry Elder takes a no prisoner style, using such old-fashioned things as evidence and logic. Larry shines the bright light of reasoned analysis on many of the myths and hypocrisies apparent in our system of government, our society, and the media itself. He is a best-selling author, one of the country's top radio show hosts, and a frequent guest on all the top national news shows, and now the executive producer of an amazing documentary, Uncle Tom. Larry, we're thrilled to have you. Thank you.
Mitch, thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. Now I got to live up to it.
Oh, you always do. You always do.
Not too much pressure.
Larry, thank you again for being here. So I got a couple of questions, and Mitch will have some questions as well. So I saw the film, Mitch saw the film. It's a great film. What inspired you to make this film? And can you talk a little bit to the audience about why Uncle Tom is such an important film?
Well, what inspired me is the young director. His name is Justin Malone. He's a Texan. And he came to me about 2 years ago and told me he had an idea to do a film called Uncle Tom, and he wanted to interview me about it. And so we had an interview, and I didn't think that much about it, Bruce. And then maybe about a month later, he calls me and wants to show me the footage. And I said, what footage? I'd already forgotten about it. So he comes over and he shows me the footage, and I love the black and white thing, the way he did it, very stylistically. I love the interview. I love the angles. And he interviewed one other person. And I said, how far are you along in getting this project done? And essentially, he said if this were a baseball game, he was in the top half of the first inning. No money, couldn't get access to a lot of the people he wanted to talk to. I said, let's do a deal. I will raise you the money. Let me help you structure the thing. Let me help you write it. Let's get it done. And we did. And it came out on the 19th. And I'm happy to report that in its opening weekend, Bruce, it doubled the opening weekend box office revenues of Bowling for Columbine, which went on to become the 5th highest grossing political documentary of all time. The reason I believe it's so important is because of, in my humble opinion, racism has never been a more insignificant factor in success in American life. It is my opinion that never have we obsessed more about it in recent years. And this whole notion that the police are going out and getting black people, which is apparently what's igniting all of these protests, is a bogus one. It's not like the federal government hasn't studied this. It's not like colleges haven't studied this. The data are just not there. The police are not disproportionately using deadly force against Black people. If anything, they're more hesitant, more reluctant to pull the trigger against a Black person. There is a Harvard economist, Black, named Roland Fryer. He is so bright, he is the Harvard's youngest ever tenured professor. And Harvard is the oldest college in the country, so that's how smart this guy is. And he assumed that it was the case that the police were in fact using deadly force disproportionately against Black people because of all the high profile killings, whether it's Eric Gardner or Freddie Gray or what have you. So he decided to do a study. And he was shocked that he found out nobody had ever done a study on it. He thought he would just do a study to confirm it. He said, my findings were the most surprising of my career. Not only were the police not using deadly force against Black people disproportionately, they were more hesitant, more reluctant to pull the trigger against a Black suspect than against a white suspect, probably because they were afraid of being accused of being racist. But the point is, they were more reluctant. And that same thing was confirmed by a massive study done and published in the journal put out by the National Academy of Sciences. Every shooting in 2015, every shooting and killing in 2016 examined, no evidence whatsoever of this kind of bias. And finally, ever since the mid-90s, during the Bill Clinton administration, there's something called the Police Public Contact Survey that the DOJ does every 3 years. And they ask 60,000 Americans, did you have a contact with the police last year? If the answer is yes, then there's a series of follow-up questions. How were you treated? What was said to you? Was any physical force used? Again, no evidence whatsoever of any kind of pattern of abuse. Now, when I say stuff like this, instead of people, including Black people, saying, isn't this good news? I'm an Uncle Tom. I'm a sellout. I'm a coon. I'm out to get my own people. And I always tell people, at the very least, you would say, well, I wish Larry Elder were right. He may be naive, but why am I a villain? And that's what this movie talks about. Why is it that Candace Owens, Alan West, Herman Cain, Carol Swain, some of the others, famous and not so famous in this film, attack simply for raising questions about whether or not we ought to be in the party that opposes school vouchers? Should we be in the party that's a party of porous borders on the grounds that illegal aliens, unskilled ones, pose competition for jobs that would otherwise be held by unskilled Black and brown people and put downward pressure on their wages? Maybe we ought not be in that party. And instead of having a healthy discussion about all this, people like that, Thomas Sowell, Clarence Thomas, Walter Williams, are denounced as Uncle Toms and sellouts. And the movie explores this phenomenon through the eyes of all of these hardworking, persevering people who believe in themselves, believe in this country, and believe that they have a right to think independently.
Larry, Stephanie and I watched your film, and it ran the gamut of emotions: maddening, inspiring, touching. It was incredible. Kudos to you. I was particularly touched by your comment about when you went to sleepaway camp and someone called you the N-word and how the other kids jumped all over him. And that was just truly amazing. So did you ever think our country could or would get to this point of where we are today?
The point being that this kind of, we're at each other's throats. Well, we all put in context. So the Gallup poll just came out and said, yes, Americans for the first time in a long time consider race to be its most important problem at 19%. But in the 60s, that number was almost 52%. So in perspective, we have to look at this. And the reason for this number is not because we're not getting along well. I mean, look at the number one thing that anthropologists will tell you is a factor in determining whether or not people get along. And that's intermarriage and interdating. And it is booming. We live in California. Probably 1 out of every 4 marriages is an interracial marriage. In the country, roughly 1 out of every 5. It's never been higher. So are you guaranteed, if you're a minority, of being able to get into a college or university if you have a given SAT score and a given set of grades? In fact, you have an easier time compared to a white kid with the same set of grades and scores. Every Fortune 500 company has a diversity consultant or an outreach person or some other similarly named person to make sure that the corporation is aggressively seeking qualified minority people and making sure they're having a good opportunity in the corporation. It is bad business to be perceived as being racist. So if the route to the middle class is getting a good education, and I have an easier time than a white kid of getting into a college university of my choice, then what are we doing talking about institutional racism? The real problem is the lousy education people are getting in the inner city K through 12, and the teachers union and the Democrats are joined at the hip and don't want to do anything about it. And the welfare state that has incentivized women to marry the government and allowed men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility. We've gone from having 25% of Black kids born outside of wedlock in 1965 to 70% now. And forget about elder. Obama said a kid raised without a father is 5 times more likely to be poor and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in jail. Now the question is, why have we gone from 25% to 70% now? And I argue it's the so-called war on poverty that was launched with the best of intentions, and what you've done is to financially incentive people into making bad choices. Well, now we have this cycle of underclass Black people. About a third or so of Black people could be probably called in that category. The rest of Black people are doing just fine. It's the lousy schools, the bad leadership, the anti-cop attacks, the crime going on in the inner city that is being ignored. What happened the other weekend in Chicago? 14 people shot and killed, over 100 wounded. And we're talking about removing a Confederate statue? I didn't see any Confederate generals leaving the scene of the crime, did you? I mean, it's ridiculous, but it's what the media does for ratings and what the Democrats do for votes.
Thank you.
Larry, could you comment on some of the more famous cases involving unarmed Black civilians who were either killed or murdered? I know a lot of people on the left use that as examples that they cite over and over again. But some of the facts, I mean, the George Floyd thing was horrible. What I saw on TV, that was just ridiculous. But some of the other ones were not as clear cut. And I hear that from athletes. I hear that from Hollywood all the time. And there are good people that want to stop, racism, but maybe they're misinformed.
Well, you have to, again, look at this thing in perspective. There are roughly a minimum of 50 million calls the police have to address. More than that, when you look at the things that they do on the way to the calls and the interactions that they have with individuals. You're talking about at least 50 million interactions. 11 million people are arrested, charged and arrested. 1,000 people are killed by the police, even though nearly 60,000 officers were assaulted last year. In my opinion, the police have exercised extreme restraint. Of the 1,000 people that were killed in a recent year, 500 of them were white, 250 of them were Black. Virtually all of the white and Black people killed were resisting arrest, either with a weapon or violently or both. When you get down to the unarmed Black people, you're talking about last year, according to the Washington Post, 15 Black unarmed Black people were killed by the police. 9 were shot and killed, 15 altogether. 19 whites were shot and killed, more than that altogether unarmed. Now, is anybody caring about the 19 unarmed white people who were shot and killed? I defy you to even name anybody. It is rare for the police to shoot anybody, let alone an unarmed person, let alone an unarmed Black person. And by the way, the media doesn't care if it's a Black cop who shoots an unarmed Black person. A Black cop is more likely to shoot a suspect than a white one because the Black cop is more likely to be put in a high crime area. But nobody seems to care about that. The point is the shootings have gone down dramatically. CDC said over the last 60 years, the percentage at which the police have killed Blacks has declined 75%. It is rare. What's not rare, unfortunately, is the garden variety homicide that's going on in our cities. Of all the homicides in this country, half of them are Black victims, and almost all these Black victims are killed by somebody else who is Black. Very rare are there white-Black or Black-white interracial homicides, but to the extent that there are, last year there were 750, and guess what? 500 white people were killed by Blacks, even though Blacks are 13% of the population. 250 Blacks were killed by whites, even though they're 61% of the population. Nobody cares about that. Interracial violent crime. Last year, roughly 600,000 acts of interracial violent crime, excluding homicide. And that's attempted homicide, assault with a weapon, rape. 85% were Black perpetrators and 15% were white victims. 85%. So if you're talking about what LeBron James said when Mr. Arbery was jogging and he was tracked down and he was shot, LeBron James puts out the tweet the next day and says, "We can't even leave our houses without fear of being tracked down." Fear of who being tracked down? A young Black boy is 8 times more likely to be a victim of a homicide than a young white boy. The #1 cause of preventable death for young white boys is accidents, like car accidents. #1 cause of preventable death for a young Black boy of any kind of death is homicide, again, almost always at the hands of another Black person. So all these protesters are protesting over a bogus notion. You asked me about some of these high-profile cases. Let's go over a couple of them. Freddie Gray, 2015, Baltimore. He's the one who was in the van, and apparently the van was jogging, and it snapped his neck. 6 officers were charged. 3 of the officers were black. The state attorney who brought the charges against the 6 officers, black. The judge before whom 2 of the cases were tried, black. The mayor at the time, black. Number 1, number 2 people running the police department, black. All the city council Democrat, majority black. At the time, the U.S. attorney, Loretta Lynch, was black, as was the president of the United States. And we're talking about institutional racism when black people are running the institution. It's a joke. And every single one of these cases, Bruce, every one of them, the Obama administration had an opportunity to bring civil rights charges on the grounds that these officers were violating the civil rights of Eric Gardner, of Freddie Gray, of Tamir Rice in Cleveland, of Sandra Bland in Texas, of Philando Castile in Minneapolis. They brought charges against none of them. And the reason they did is because they had no grounds. Finally, just because somebody is unarmed does not mean they're not dangerous. Michael Brown was unarmed. He claimed, his friend did, that he said, hands up, no shoot. We found out that was completely bogus. His DNA was found on the officer's gun, for crying out loud. He was a big guy. He was trying to get the officer's gun, and he was shot and killed. And the Obama DOJ said it was a legitimate shooting and did not bring charges. My point is, just because somebody's unarmed does not mean they're not dangerous. And because somebody's unarmed does not mean that they were not reasonably perceived as being dangerous. Remember that immigrant in New York? His name is Amadou Diallo. The police thought he was somebody else, but he matched the description. They told him to show his hands. He reaches for his wallet. They thought he was reaching for his gun. They blew him away. Officers were tried. A multi-ethnic jury found the officers not guilty. So unarmed on the stat block without knowing more facts makes it look even worse than it is. When you get down to really analyzing, you're talking about 2 or 3 cases, arguably, that might be in the gray area. And almost always, the cops are not defended by other cops. I haven't seen a single cop that said, yeah, what happened to George Floyd was okay with me. None. So what's the point of the riots? If you're having a consensus on the left, on the right, and in the middle, this is not a good thing, we need to change the tactics, then why are you in the streets? You're in the streets for another reason. I think it's a combination of Trump derangement syndrome. A lot of people have been taught that they're victims by what I call the access of indoctrination. And I think they were all keyed up because of the coronavirus shutdown. You add it all up, and that's a cocktail of what we got going on right now, I think.
You know, Larry, your command of the statistics is truly remarkable. In Uncle Tom, you mentioned the monolithic black vote for the Democratic Party, roughly 95%. We in the Jewish religion are not that far behind. Unfortunately, as you know, about 78% voted for Obama the first time, but only 69% voted for him the second time, which is remarkable. Nonetheless, if you had to prognosticate on the percentage of blacks and Jews that will vote for Trump this November, what's your take on that, Larry?
Well, I'll tell you, Mitch, if the black vote became the percentage of the Jewish vote for the Republican Party, I'd be dancing on the moon. If we could get up to 20, 25% or 30% or so of black people voting for the Republican Party, that would be a larger margin, I think, than anybody since maybe Richard Nixon. I think he got 32%. And I think Eisenhower before that got 39%. I think that Donald Trump will at least get 50% to 100% more than what he got in 2016 because of how the economy was doing before the coronavirus pandemic set down. The First Step Act, which allows people to have their sentences reviewed. And under that First Step Act, about 1,000 people, mostly black men, have had their sentences reduced an average of about 75 months. He spent more money on historical black colleges than anybody else. He's done more money for enterprise zones, for crying out loud. He supports vouchers. And by the way, look at the polls. A majority of black and brown parents living in the inner city support vouchers. You know who does it? White Democrats. Now, it seems to me, if I'm a black or brown Democrat, I'm looking at that and I'm going, am I in the right room here? And then you have Trump doing something about illegal immigration. And The Economist has done more work on illegal immigration than maybe anybody else. There's a guy named George Borjas from Harvard. He said, illegal immigration has benefits and costs around the country depending upon who you are, what your economic stature is. But if you are an unskilled person, they pose a threat to you for jobs and puts downward pressure on your wages. Now you've got a guy in the White House who wants to do something about it, as opposed to another guy he's running against who wants to legalize a bunch of illegal aliens and couldn't care less about how porous the borders are. You know, why am I pulling the lever 95% for this party? So this debate is taking place in this country, and I think I'm immodest enough to think, Mitch, that this movie, Uncle Tom, is going to ignite that debate and might even move the needle a little bit more in the favor of the right direction.
Thank you.
So, Larry, if you were President Elder, what would you?
Can I first say I didn't say anything about the Jewish vote?
Oh, go ahead.
I think it's probably going to be about the same. I mean, this man is intensely disliked. No matter what he does, he's accused of being anti-Semitic. I mean, I look at the results. He's moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, despite the predictions that there's going to be all this kind of violence. And as you know, both Republican and Democrat presidents, including Obama, said they were going to do it, didn't do squat. He's been a staunch supporter of Israel. He hasn't been condemning them the way Obama did and Joe Biden did about building settlements and about being bellicose and so forth. He's been amazing for Israel, and I know he's popular in Israel. But here in America, as you know, most Jews are left-wing before they're Jews. Most Jews in America are tax, spend, regulate. The system's unfair before they are supporters of Israel. I wish that weren't the case, but as far as I can tell, that is the case.
Thank you.
Oh, very, very true.
Yeah.
My question: if you were President Elder and in charge of things,
I demand a recount.
yeah, I'm ready to vote for you. How do we change things? How do we? I know Uncle Tom, the movie that everybody's going to go out and see, is going to really bring about some really great points and start a really good dialogue. The timing is incredible that it's coming out now. But what else can we do to change this avalanche of left-wing extremism that is just haunting our country? I mean, I don't even believe what I'm seeing on the news every day.
Right. Well, if I were to be elected, one would think that it would be because I would have enough power and enthusiasm behind policies that I want to enact. So if I were president, I would do a whole lot of things. The first thing is I wouldn't take a knife to the problem of big government. I would take a chainsaw to it. Government is at least 5 times too big. In 1900, at all 3 levels, government took less than 10% from the American people, Bruce. And when I said that one time on television, I got fact-checked. One of these fact-check people called me. They were floored by that stat. And I gave them the source, and they said that Elder was right about that. This is a young person who had no blooming idea. Government at all 3 levels, federal, state, and local, took less than 10% of the American people. Today, when you add up what they all take, plus put on a price of unfunded mandates, government takes almost half away from the American people. One of the reasons we have all these contentious elections is because of our healthcare system. Well, suppose government was not involved in healthcare, then I wouldn't give a damn whether or not Biden took over or Trump took over, as long as my healthcare system were privatized. And so we'd have a lot less rancor and a lot less to fight about if government were the size the founding fathers truly wanted. So I would urge Congress to draft a balanced budget amendment, keeping spending to a fixed percentage of the GDP. I'm thinking 10%, no more than that. With exceptions for emergencies and war. And that way the budget would always be balanced, would always be limited, because even if you balance the budget, Congress would just spend it again. So you have to have an amendment, tie their hands so they can only spend a certain percentage of it. That's one of the things I would do. I would eliminate every single anti-discrimination law on the books. If you want to discriminate against somebody and you have private property, that is your right to do so. I believe in freedom, and freedom is the right to exercise your freedom in ways that I find repulsive. But if somebody were to do that, I would, Larry Elder, have the right to allow the world to know that this SOB won't hire people who look like me, and therefore I'm urging my friends not to shop in that particular store. I just think this intrusion of freedoms is a cancer, and it's because of what I call the axis of indoctrination. That's Hollywood, academia, and media. And government ought not be involved in education either. I mean, I am really, really radical. When someone once asked me if I wanted to run for president, I said the first thing I would do if I were an opponent is I go over Larry Elder's speeches and play how radical he sounds and how extremist he sounds. And he might be able to get his parents to vote for him. And they're no longer with us, so I'm not even sure I would get that vote. But honestly, we have taken away freedom from the American people. Government is too big, has intruded too much. The Supreme Court shouldn't even be involved in issues like abortion, shouldn't be involved in issues like same-sex marriage, shouldn't be involved in issues like doctor-assisted suicide. And Antonin Scalia said, we are the Supreme Court. I went to law school. I don't know anything about these issues. If people really follow the Constitution, these should be left to the states and to the democratic processes and not to the federal government.
Larry, one of my favorite authors is Napoleon Hill, and he had a famous saying, within every adversity is the seed of a greater or equivalent opportunity. Most of us wake up every morning so upset and overwhelmed with what we see happening to our beloved country. What would you tell us to help inspire us about what good could come from all of this? Because it's we're being buried with an avalanche of bad news daily.
Well, I still am, and I tell my friends, I'm cautiously pessimistic. I believe that the captain of the Titanic, had he known the iceberg was ahead, he would have taken corrective action. It is your job, my job, our job to let people know iceberg ahead. I kind of thought that when Obama got elected, two things would happen. There would be a fork put in the notion that America was institutionally racist, and every cockamamie left-wing idea that you think that you want to try in Harvard, he was able to try, and it was a disaster. Notice how they never, ever, ever mentioned cars for clunkers, cash for caulkers. Remember those two stupid programs designed to put money? They never mentioned this. They never mentioned the stimulus. They never, because they didn't work. All these left-wing policies did not work. And we had the worst economic recovery since 1949. And even Obama, when he came in, his economic team put together this big paper about what would happen if we don't do anything. And they predicted if we don't do anything, GDP would grow at 3%. And if we do all these wonderful things, it's going to grow at 4%. Well, they did all the wonderful things. It grew at less than around 2%, the worst economic recovery in the history of this country since 1949. The first president ever to preside over a recovery without 3% GDP. And the difference between 2% and 3% GDP is 1 million jobs times the length of the recovery. So if the man had just played golf or practiced on his jump shot and not gone to work, we would have had 7 million more jobs. Instead, he took a meat axe to the economy and made things worse. Now, I kind of thought that even people who voted for him would step back and go, wow, Donald Trump rolled back these regulations, cut taxes on corporations, brought back manufacturing jobs that Obama said would require a magic wand. Maybe just, it hasn't happened. They're still rationalizing it, still coming up with all sorts of excuses. I guess they don't see the iceberg. I'm not yelling loudly enough. I guess I'm not articulating it well enough. I got to keep trying. I'm not going to quit.
Before we go to questions from the audience, I just wanted to say something and then I'll ask a quick question. What many of you don't know is Larry Elder was our first big keynote speaker for the Jewish Republican Alliance. And he packed the house. It was an energizing event. And then I asked Larry if he would introduce Candace. He immediately said yes. It was amazing. We had 1,000 people there the day before they shut down the world.
Right.
What a lot of people don't know is that Larry stayed 30 to 45 minutes after the event, stepped down from the stage and was shaking hands and posing for pictures with people and giving him his time and answering questions. And, you know, this is the Larry Elder that a lot of people don't know behind the scenes. You know, I'm so grateful for our friendship and all that you have done, that you are doing to inspire all of us. So now that you've been to a couple of our JRA events, what are your thoughts about us, the JRA, and our organization?
I love the enthusiasm. I love that you're in the fight, and you're in the same fight I am. You're looking at Jews, I'm looking at Black people, and I'm looking at all these policies that are antithetical to the best interests of Jews, the best interests of Blacks. And I'm asking the same question you're asking, is why are you pulling that lever for this party? I mean, my goodness, look at race-based preferences. They're trying to bring that back here in California. We repealed Proposition 209, we passed Proposition 209 to get rid of race-based preferences. And by the way, the man that led that fight is a Black man named Ward Connerly, happened to be married to a white woman. And one of his political opponents is a woman named Diane Watson. You remember this, Bruce. She was a state lawmaker at the time, and she publicly said, Black woman, let me tell you why you oppose affirmative action. Because you're married to a white woman. You have no ethnic pride. You want to be white. You don't want to be Black. Next day, she was asked about this comment by reporters and asked to retract it. She said, that's right, I said it. I'm not going to retract it. And ran for and got elected to the House of Representatives and served several terms. I mean, talk about bigoted. Nobody ever brings this stuff up. Joe Biden says, well, if you haven't decided whether you want me or Trump, then you ain't really Black. Joe Biden has to apologize. Bull. That's what that party believes. The year before, Ayanna Pressley, one quarter of the squad, was at a Net Roots conference, and she said, we don't need any more brown faces who don't want to be a brown voice. We don't need any more Black faces who don't want to be a Black voice. What is that but saying there's only one way to be Black, only one way to be brown? And that is why I made Uncle Tom. And by the way, you can see it on UncleTom.com. And be the first in your hood to get Uncle Tom merch.
Our fantastic host, Mark Whithour, has already posted to our audience the link to purchase it.
Great.
Absolutely. Larry, we have some amazing questions from the audience. There's so many. I'm going to try to pick out the best ones. Here's a great question from Terry, a former JRA speaker himself. What is your favorite comeback when people call you an Uncle Tom in a one-on-one conversation? Conservatives are always called names, and too many just shut up in the face of attacks. You know, you don't shut up in the face of attacks.
Well, I don't think I have anything clever, but I will tell you what one of the guys in the movie said. He said, I used to be irritated when people call me Uncle Tom. Now I say thank you, because it shows you they haven't read the book. If they read the book, they'll find that Uncle Tom was actually a hero who was patterned after a real live slave named Josiah Henson, who in fact bamboozled his boss and master into thinking that he was a sellout when in fact he was helping to free slaves. So people that use the term Uncle Tom really have never read the novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It was a religious-based novel. It was basically a screed against slavery. And when Abraham Lincoln met the novelist, he said to her, because people in the North had never really thought about the depravity of slavery, had not thought about the conditions in which slaves were kept. She described this in graphic detail. And Abraham Lincoln said to her, you're the little lady that started the Civil War, meaning it energized the North. It made them become aware of the depravity of the South. And a lot of people feel that but for that novel, maybe the Civil War never would have taken place, or never would have taken place when it did. So my long answer to your question is, when people call you an Uncle Tom, they are displaying, frankly, their ignorance because they haven't read the book. If they had, they would know the villain in the book is a character named Sambo, not Uncle Tom. So it means you haven't read the book. But if people call you stuff like that, it means they're out of ammo. That's how I look at it. I don't get mad. I pity the fact that you have been indoctrinated, manipulated by Hollywood, by media and academia, so that I'm your enemy. I'm telling you to work hard. I'm telling you when you are encountering the police, do as my dad told me. Left hand at 10 o'clock, right hand at 2 o'clock. Yes, sir. No, sir. Make sure your paperwork is in order. And if you feel you've been mistreated, get a name, get a badge number, and you can deal with it while you're still alive. And I'm the enemy? I'm a villain? What's wrong with you? Who has tortured your brain so that you feel that way? And that's what my movie explores.
Larry, we have a question from Alana questioning why people support Black Lives Matter and your views on the organization Black Lives Matter.
Well, Black people support Black Lives Matter because of their lack of understanding, lack of knowledge of what the real facts are. As I just mentioned, the Washington Post, 1,000 people killed by the police last year. 500 of them were white, 250 of them were Black. Bruce, I gave a talk before the Ohio State football team. I was invited by the then coach, Urban Meyer. And the reason he invited me, he had a Black Lives Matter type in there the month before, got all the players all hyped up, and he wanted me to come in because he knew I had a different perspective. So I'm up there with all these players, and there's about 100 of them, most of them are Black, and their arms are folded. They were not happy. I'm giving them stat after stat after stat. And then I came to the unarmed whites who were killed. And I said, at least as many unarmed whites every year are killed as unarmed Blacks. In that particular year, there happened to have been more unarmed whites killed by unarmed Blacks. I had my microphone in my hand, Bruce, and I said, last year there were more unarmed whites killed by the police than unarmed Blacks. Name one. I dropped the mic. It went like this. And just stood back for 30 seconds. It was beautiful. I was hoping nobody was going to name one. Nobody did.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Larry, we have a very insightful question from Maryland. Who do you think is bankrolling this violent revolutionary reactionary movement, and what is the ultimate purpose?
Well, I know a lot of people feel that George Soros' fingerprints are all over this thing, and I think they are. But it's not like it requires a whole lot of impetus. It's like this story, supposedly, that the Taliban is being bribed by the Russians to kill soldiers. Taliban don't need a bribe to kill American soldiers. We're already at war with them. So the left has been convinced, as I said, by this generation of indoctrination from television, from media, from academia, from Hollywood, that you're a victim, that America got wealthy, not because of hard work and industry and values that allow people that have different religions and different ethnic groups to get along together to a degree that no other country has ever seen before. No, America got wealthy because they exploited black people. America got wealthy because of slavery. America got wealthy because of the backs of the people that worked on railroads. And none of it is true. The reason the North won the Civil War is because of slavery, because they outproduced the South. Because when you have slave labor, especially when you're afraid they're going to run away during a war, it's not a very productive kind of thing. So the idea that but for slavery, America would not be wealthy is completely and total BS.
We have a question from Marilyn, who is discussing the whole concern that a lot of us have with they call it mail-in ballots and ballot harvesting. I call it cheat by mail. She wants to know, how can we make sure this is stopped before the 2020 election? What can we do?
I don't know how we can stop it. I'm not sure how we're going to have an election if the coronavirus pandemic hysteria is still going on, which is exactly what they want. This is exactly why the media has no problem with Joe Biden being in the basement. That's why in my opinion, they're fanning this thing. As long as we're still concerned about the coronavirus pandemic to the extent that we want people to stay at home, Joe Biden has a built-in excuse as to why he's not out having press conferences. As soon as he opens his mouth, he says something stupid, and so they want him to speak less. It also then takes a hammer to the economy. That was remains Donald Trump's still biggest card. He doesn't get good marks on foreign policy. He doesn't get good marks on how he's handling the coronavirus, but he still has better marks than Biden does on the economy. So therefore, let's damage the economy. That's what's going on here. I'm not sure there's very much that can be done about it. I just hope that people are lying to the pollsters the way they did it apparently in 2016 and did not tell them. And I hope that there's going to be a groundswell of people as this election gets closer and closer to realize we really want somebody who's going to continue the march towards single payer. We really want somebody who's going to legalize, they say 11 million. I bet it's 20 million illegal aliens in this country. There was a massive study done by a few professors at Yale, I think last year or the year before, and they said the number is most likely 20 million illegal aliens, and that will dramatically change the electorate, which is why the Democrats want this. So I'm just hoping that the economy improves. People recognize that Joe Biden, about 20% of Democrats believe he has dementia. 60% of people recently at a poll suggest he has to address the issue of whether he has dementia. So you add that up, and I think that, at least I hope, the American people come November are going to pull that lever again for Donald Trump. But I believe if he wins this time, Bruce, it's going to be an even more miraculous victory than last time for three reasons. They've got plenty of money thanks to the Trump economy. They hate his guts to a degree I've never seen before, and he no longer will have the element of surprise the way he did last time. Joe Biden is not going to refuse to set foot in Wisconsin the way Hillary did. He's not going to be overconfident the way Hillary was. So for all these reasons, it's going to be a more difficult task this time than last time.
Very sobering assessment, Larry. We have a great question from Jason. How do you debunk this relatively new idea that blacks or brown people cannot be racist? Or to be racist, you must have power?
Well, ask Reginald Denny when that Damian Football Williams guy had that brick and was pounding him to death and almost killed him, whether or not he perceives this guy to have been racist. What is it? I can't be biased against somebody because I'm black. Well, can Oprah Winfrey be biased against somebody? She's black and rich, or can only be black poor people not be biased against other people? Successful black people, I would imagine, can be biased against other people, can they? It's just, you know, I've heard that for years, that only if you have power can you really be racist. So then David Duke has no power, so therefore he's not racist? What does that even mean?
So a lot of this that I see happening comes from the indoctrination that we're seeing in the schools,
Right.
in Hollywood. I mean, thank God for the movie Uncle Tom to give them something else to see, that it's not just the same narrative. Even the little subtle things that if you watch Amazon or Netflix, there's always a little political type of little subtle thing that they put in there. And how do we stop our kids from, you know, they're being shamed now. Now, if you don't support the organization Black Lives Matter, even though you are a very good person and you don't like that organization, even if you're silent now, you're being shamed for being silent and called a racist. How do we have a society like that and have any open communication at all with that mentality?
Well, this is all we talk about. What they don't want to hear is the truth. And the truth is, this is no longer an issue in American life. My goodness. I remember reading about Barack Obama, Senator Obama, when he was thinking about running for office, and running for president. And he assembled all of his homies, David Axelrod, Pluff, Valerie Jarrett, all of his advisors in a room. And according to Time or Newsweek, whichever one wrote a very long article about it, I forget which one I read, said that they talked about the pros, the cons, him being from Hawaii, him having a name difficult to pronounce, him being from race never came up. That's because, Bruce, this man does not think of himself as black. This man thinks of himself the same way that Larry Elder thinks of himself, as badass. He thinks of himself as somebody that can do whatever he wants to do. And we know this because before he became president, he gave a speech at a black church. And he's talking about how much more we had to do to get to the other side, to realize MLK's dream. And he said, my generation, the Joshua generation, has to complete the task that was set out by the MLK generation, the Moses generation. The Moses generation, Obama said then, has gotten us 90% of the way there. My generation, he said, the Joshua generation, has to get us that additional 10%. Now that's before he became president, let alone reelected. And don't you think that reduced that 10% just a little bit? And for perspective, 8% of the American people believe there is, quote, a good chance, close quote, that Elvis is still alive. So I'm not sure how much further you can cut into that, to that 8%. This is a man who said when Steve Kroft of 60 Minutes first interviewed him, this is a senator who was coming to challenge Hillary. He wasn't the front runner yet. He was a long shot, but good enough to be sat down for his first 60-minute interview. And Steve Kroft said, Senator, if you don't win this race, will it be because of racism? And Bruce, I sat back and I said, let's see how this man answers this question. This is going to say a lot about him. And he said, no. If I don't get the nomination, it will be because I have failed to articulate a vision that the American people can embrace. And I said, wow, I'm not going to vote for a tax, spend, regulate liberal, but at least he's not what I call a victocrat. He gets into office, every single chance he had to heal things, he went the other direction. The Cambridge police acted stupidly. No, they didn't. If I had a son, he looked like Trayvon. What does that even mean? The jury found George Zimmerman not guilty, and the black alternate said race never came up, and had I been on the jury, I would have found the man not guilty as well. If there was he gave a speech before the United Nations. There's a place called Ferguson. So yeah, we have our own problems in America. Well, Ferguson was a lie. Hands up, don't shoot was a lie. He embraced Black Lives Matter. He brought in Al Sharpton over 70 times, and his AG Eric Holder said, when it comes to matters of race, America has been a nation of cowards, and constantly played the race card to a degree only rivaled maybe by Al Sharpton. He made things worse because the political Obama knows you have to get black people stirred up and angry about social justice, so they go in there and pull that lever, 95% from my party. Otherwise, I can't be reelected. But the commencement exercise, Obama, the one that gives exercise commencement speeches at Howard and says things like, if you had to choose any time in history, anywhere in history to be born, it would be right here and right now. That ain't what you said when you were president. You said racism is in our DNA. What happened to that guy? So he's got two guys going back and forth. He knows it's BS, but he knows he needs it for politics.
Larry, there's a question from Marilyn in Calabasas. This is a very serious topic that you talked about, Dennis has talked about. What do we do realistically to stop the colleges and now high schools and middle schools from brainwashing our children?
We need school choice. The Democratic Party, as you know, mandates you're going to go to a school whether you want to or not. I went to Crenshaw High School. Excuse me, that's the high school center of the movie Boys in the Hood. Front page article, LA Times a couple years ago, only 3% of my former high school can do math at grade level. And it is a Crip school. And the reason I know that, even though the gangs did not happen until after I graduated, is because Ice-T later on went to my high school and told me he picked Crenshaw High School because he wanted to go to a Crip school. So you're living within the geographical radius of my high school. You are mandated to send your kid to a school where only 3% of kids can do math at grade level. And by the way, it is a school run by the Crips. This party over here is mandating that your kid go. This party over here wants to give you a voucher to go somewhere else where the climate is different, where the teaching is different, where the administration is different, where the expectations are different. And the studies have shown where they have had vouchers, they're varying qualities, but when you release these regulations and change the rules and get parental involvement, you're seeing substantially higher graduation rates, higher reading rates, higher math rates, and much, much higher rates of parental satisfaction and enthusiasm. And so why it is we don't have choice K through 12 is beyond me. We have choice for college, we have choice for preschool, but there's a no-fly zone over K through 12 to reserve all these jobs for teachers. And one more final thing. Ask yourself this: where do public school teachers send their own school-age kids? 10% of the American families have their kids in private school. 6% of Black families do. However, in Philadelphia, among public school teachers that have school-age kids, 44% of the teachers have their kids in private schools. Chicago, 39%. LA, 28%. Now, that's the equivalent of opening up a restaurant saying, come on in, just don't eat the food. Come on. We need choice.
So in addition to the great film Uncle Tom, we all know that Larry Elder has a daily radio show. Larry, have you invited some of these Black athletes and now even some of the owners to come on to your show and debate you on some of the more current issues? And what do they say? Do they turn you down?
Well, over the years, yeah, they turned me down. Remember Jesse Williams that did that 4-minute rant at BET that sort of kickstarted, helped to raise the consciousness of police brutality? He gave a 4-minute rant at an awards ceremony on BET. It was written about in Time magazine. Virtually everything he said in there was wrong. He said the police do not engage in shooting white people every day. In fact, the police shoot more than one white person and kill one white person every day. So I wrote a long article refuting every single thing he said, invited him on my show, called him, used social media, used every means I had to get to this guy. Never got a return phone call. Don Lemon will not come on. I invited him on, won't come on. Jesse Jackson, I've been on the air, Bruce, you know, almost 30 years. Jesse Jackson has never come on. I've invited him maybe 50 to 100 times. We finally stopped asking. Al Sharpton, 50 to 100, stopped asking. Louis Farrakhan, 50 to 100, stopped asking. But one of these so-called Black leaders did in fact come on my show maybe 10 years ago or so. His name is Kawese Mfume. At the time, he was the president of the NAACP. And my first question out of the gate, this is verbatim because I worked on this, I said, Mr. Mfume, as between the presence of white racism or the absence of Black fathers, which poses a bigger threat to the Black community? And without missing a beat, he said the absence of Black fathers. That is far and away the bigger problem facing this country. And regarding the so-called major Black leaders in this country, Jesse Jackson, Sharpton, Farrakhan, all three of these men either had absent relationships with their fathers or difficult ones. In the case of Farrakhan, his mother was estranged from her husband, had a boyfriend, took back up with the husband, got pregnant, didn't want the boyfriend to know, and tried to abort Farrakhan with a coat hanger. Jesse Jackson's mother was the pregnant teenage mom who got pregnant by the married man next door. And in those days, that was very, very rare. And he was raised in South Carolina. And according to a biography of him, Jesse was taunted, Jesse ain't got no daddy, Jesse ain't got no daddy. It deeply scarred him. Al Sharpton had a nice middle class life until his father abandoned the family, and then down to the hood he went. So all three of these men know about the damage that occurs when you don't have a stable father in the house, and that's what they should be talking about. Instead, they're talking about the white man this, racism that, as if nothing has changed in the past 30 years. It's ridiculous.
Excellent. We're winding it down. I got a very deep question from Ilana. And
Mitch,
Larry.
It's getting warmed up. We can't wind it down.
Oh, boy.
I'm just kidding.
We'll go as long as you want to go, Larry.
Believe me, our audience is loving you. You should see the comments. There's so many great questions from our JRA community. It's hard to choose. This one is quite interesting. There are so many Jews that wholeheartedly support BLM. And most of us on this call have done our homework. We know it was founded on anti-Semitism. It's still ripe with anti-Semitism. How do you have a decent discussion with fellow Jews about Black Lives Matter?
One of my dearest friends is named Artie Silverman. He is a businessman in Chicago. We known each other ever since we were in college. I was a law student. He was an engineering student. We both vowed we were going to start our own businesses. We both ended up working for large companies. We call each other almost every day. When are you going to quit and start your company? When are you going to quit and start your company? Well, I quit and started my company, and then later on he quit and started his company. So we've always been very, very good friends, have had a lot of good experiences together, even went into business together and started a little company. So he's one of my closest friends. And shortly after we met, Mitch, he said to me, Larry, why are you so hard on Black people? I said, Artie, if 70% of Jewish kids were raised without fathers, and 50% of Jewish kids in the inner city were dropping out of high school, and those who do graduate could not read, write, and compute at grade level, and if a quarter of inner city Jewish boys had criminal records, either in jail, arrested, on parole, or on probation, and the so-called Jewish leaders were blaming this on the Holocaust, how the blank would you feel? And he said, I withdraw the question.
Larry, what do you say we have an anonymous attendee that asked a question about the Confederate flags and monuments? Surely, why isn't everybody opposed to Confederate flags and people who stood for slavery, mostly Democrats back then, by the way? How do you answer that?
Somewhat a long answer, if I may. When my mom and my dad were around, my father is from Athens, Georgia. My mother is from Huntsville, Alabama, both deep, deep South. And during one time when this controversy arose, I asked both my mother and my father what they thought. And they looked at me and they said, out of all the things that are going on right now, all the crime going on, all the people needing jobs, all the people getting crappy educations in high school, and we're talking about Confederate monuments, my parents said, we're indifferent, couldn't care less. They can stay, they cannot stay, couldn't care less. That was their opinion. By the way, Robert E. Lee opposed erecting Confederate monuments, and a lot of people who want monuments down have cited him. What they don't tell you is that Robert E. Lee felt there shouldn't be any monuments to the Civil War. He thought it was a bloody thing that happened, a horrible thing that happened between two halves of our country, and better not to erect monuments to the victors or to the vanquished. That's how he felt. So I think what I would do is, if you're unhappy with these statues, how about putting some monument next to them, saying what an SOB they were on the wrong side of the issue in those days, and then erect some monuments of people that you think ought to be honored. I'd love to see a monument of Walter Williams somewhere. I'd love to see one of Thomas Sowell somewhere. I'd love to see one of Clarence Thomas somewhere. That's what I would recommend. I wouldn't go around tearing down all these kinds of monuments. It's not going to improve education in the inner city. It's not going to make, it's not going to change the fact that there are 13 high schools in Baltimore where, Bruce, 0% of kids can do math at grade level. 0. And 5 or 6 where only 1% can. That means half of the high schools in Baltimore are schools where either 0 or only 1% of the kids can do math at grade level. And we're talking about removing Confederate monuments. I dare say most of these kids at these Baltimore high schools anyway probably don't even know who Thomas Stonewall Jackson is to be mad at him to remove the statue.
Larry, I think what you're pointing out is they're majoring in minor things.
Indeed.
There's just a comment that very sweet that says, I hope you see this, and says, Larry, we love you, we appreciate you. There's I don't know if you're feeling the love, but it's there. I guess one last question before we wrap up. The Jews have a long history of helping found NAACP, working with Blacks, and somewhere along the way, the hostility from the Black community to the Jewish community has become really awful. And it's not vice versa. In fact, most rabbis now are preaching BLM and white guilt. It's horrifying us. How do we bring these two communities together?
Well, it's about the Black community's ignorance of all the things that the Jewish community has done to improve Black people throughout the history of this country. I mean, Julius Rosenwald was a Black man who worked side by side with Booker T. Washington to fund over 5,000 schools for Black kids in the South. At one time, 1 out of every 4 kids getting an education in the South was being educated at a Rosenwald school. As you know, Israel airlifted a bunch of Ethiopian Jews out of Africa facing famine and persecution in the mid-'80s and the early '90s, like 15,000 of them. And I saw at one poll, Jews were the least likely of all groups in America to hold negative views about blacks. Blacks are lazy, blacks are dumb, blacks are this, blacks are that. Jews were the least likely to say yes to any of that. And yet, MLK worked very closely with a Jewish guy named Jack Greenberg. He helped Thurgood Marshall in the strategy that won Brown versus Board of Education. And by the way, when Greenberg later on wanted to get a job as a civil rights professor at Harvard, a bunch of students at Harvard, white students, felt that he was not qualified because he wasn't black. Never mind, I mean, it's ridiculous. And of the freedom fighters that went down in the South to protest segregation in the 60s, there were 400 of them. Of 200 blacks, 200 whites. Of the whites, it is estimated that between 50% to 75% of them were Jews. Mississippi burning, when Goodwin, Schwerner, and Cheney were killed. Well, Goodwin and Schwerner were Jews. And so the idea that Jews are somehow out to get black people is BS, and yet black people are more likely to be anti-Semitic by a tune of 2.5 greater than non-black Gentiles, according to a poll commissioned by the ADL. Majority of blacks, thank goodness, are not anti-Semitic, but a higher percentage are compared to non-black Gentiles. And it is, in my opinion, because of people like Farrakhan and Al Sharpton have been able to get away with what they've been able to get away with without being chastised. I give love to Jake Tapper. Of all the anchors, he's the only one who has challenged the Congressional Black Caucus to renounce Louis Farrakhan, who has publicly embraced the Congressional Black Caucus. There's a picture of Barack Obama, a smiling Barack Obama with Louis Farrakhan, and Alan Dershowitz later on told me, had that photograph surfaced before Obama got elected president, he wouldn't have voted for it.
Well, I wanted to now stop and say thank you to Larry for being here. It was so great to hear you uninterrupted as opposed to having 2 minutes on Fox News to try to get your your point. This is going to be a lesson that people will replay. They're going to hear answers to their questions. This is going to be seen by thousands of people, and it's an important message. We want everybody who can hear the sound of our voices today to support Larry. Go to uncletom.com, get the movie, see it, tell your friends to do that as well. This is a message that has to get out. There's some great people in the movie, and you will enjoy it, and you'll be supporting a really good cause because, you know, we're all in this together. We've got to fight. I mean, this is a tough year. It's going to be heating up, and this is a message that people have to hear, and we want them to also hear Larry speaking as well, so we're going to circulate all these questions and answers for them to hear. So thank you, Larry, very much for being here. Until we meet again, everybody, Shabbat Shalom, wishing you all the best, and a happy 4th of July to everybody.
Happy Independence Day. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Larry. Thank you.